The Plague of Athens. In 430 BC, as Athens stood at the height of its golden age, something entered the city that would bring the greatest democracy the world had ever known to its knees. The Plague of Athens arrived without warning, spreading through the crowded streets with a speed that defied all understanding. Within days, the sick filled every corner of the city. Fever consumed bodies so intensely that victims threw themselves into wells seeking relief. Their skin erupted in pustules and ulcers. Thirst became unquenchable. The healthy watched in horror as neighbors, friends, and family members succumbed in waves. Thucydides, who survived the plague himself, documented what he witnessed with cold precision. He described how the disease respected no boundary of class or virtue. The wealthy died alongside the poor. Physicians who treated the sick became sick themselves and perished in greater numbers than anyone. Bodies piled in the streets because there were not enough living to bury the dead. Sacred temples became makeshift morgues. The social fabric that held Athens together simply dissolved. People abandoned the dying in their own homes. Traditional funeral rites were ignored. Law and order collapsed as survivors realized death could claim them at any moment. Modern scholars have debated the identity of this plague for centuries. Some suggest typhoid fever, others point to Ebola or typhus. Recent analysis of dental pulp from mass graves suggests typhus as the likely culprit. But what remains undisputed is the catastrophic toll. Athens lost perhaps 1/3 of its population within 4 years. Procrassus, the great statesman who had guided Athens to glory, died in the second wave. The military strength that had made Athens invincible was shattered. The Peloponnesian War, which Athens had been winning, turned against them. The plague did not just kill people, it killed the Athenian dream itself, ending the Golden Age and shifting power across the ancient world forever. The Antonine Plague. In 165 AD, Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East brought back something far more devastating than any enemy army. The Antonine Plague swept through the Roman Empire with relentless efficiency, killing millions across 2 decades. Ancient physicians had never seen anything like it. Victims developed sudden high fever followed by painful sores in the mouth and throat. A rash spread across the entire body, transforming into pustules that oozed and crusted. Many who survived were left horribly disfigured, their skin marked forever by deep pockmarks. The physician Galen, who treated victims in Rome, fled the city in terror after witnessing the devastation firsthand. His writings describe symptoms unmistakably consistent with smallpox, though some historians argue for measles, whichever pathogen it was. The disease moved through the densely packed Roman cities like wildfire through dry grass. Trade routes that had made Rome wealthy now became highways of death. The legions that had conquered the known world were decimated. Entire units ceased to exist. Military campaigns ground to a halt as commanders struggled to replace fallen soldiers. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself likely died from the plague in 180 AD, though official records obscured this fact. Estimates suggest the plague killed 5 million people, perhaps a tenth of the entire empire. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers died in their fields. Tax revenues plummeted. The economy contracted severely. Labor shortages forced Romans to recruit Germanic tribes as mercenaries, planting seeds for future invasions. Christianity, which promised salvation and provided care for the sick when pagan priests fled, gained converts in unprecedented numbers. The plague did not destroy Rome immediately, but it fractured the empire's foundation, beginning a slow decline that would take centuries to complete but had become inevitable. The Plague of Cyprian. In 249 AD, as the Roman Empire still reeled from the aftershocks of the Antonine Plague, a new pestilence emerged that made the previous catastrophe seem almost merciful. The Plague of Cyprian, named after the bishop who chronicled its horrors, arrived with symptoms so severe that witnesses believed the end of the world had come. Victims suffered from constant vomiting and uncontrollable diarrhea that left them dehydrated and weak. Their eyes became inflamed and bloodshot. Gangrene consumed feet and hands. The fever burned so intensely that hearing failed and vision dimmed. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage wrote that the plague attacked entire households simultaneously, leaving no one alive to bury the dead. He described streets filled with corpses rotting in the sun because the living were too few or too terrified to remove them. The disease showed no mercy to age or status. Infants died in their mothers' arms. Soldiers collapsed at their posts. Senators perished in their villas. At its peak, the plague reportedly killed 5,000 people per day in Rome alone, though such numbers may have been estimates born from overwhelming despair. Modern virologists studying ancient descriptions believe this may have been a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, though conclusive identification remains impossible. What cannot be disputed is the profound impact. The plague persisted for nearly 20 years, decimating populations across North Africa, Egypt, and Europe. The Roman military, already weakened, lost critical manpower. Entire legions were disbanded. Germanic and Persian enemies sensed weakness and increased pressure on the borders. Economic collapse accelerated. Farms lay abandoned. Cities shrank as survivors fled to the countryside. The persecution of Christians temporarily ceased because Roman authorities were too overwhelmed to care. The empire that had seemed eternal now appeared mortal, vulnerable, bleeding from a wound that would never fully heal. The Justinianic Plague. In 541 AD, the Byzantine Empire under Justinian the Great stood poised to reclaim the glory of ancient Rome. Justinian's armies had reconquered North Africa and Italy. Constantinople gleamed as the wealthiest city on earth. Then the plague arrived from Egypt, carried by grain ships, and everything changed. The Justinianic Plague, history's first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, transformed the Byzantine capital into a city of the dead within weeks. Victims developed sudden fever and fatigue, followed by the appearance of grotesque buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck that turned black and oozed pus. The Byzantine historian Procopius witnessed the catastrophe unfold with meticulous horror. He described how the disease killed with such speed that people went to sleep healthy and never woke. At its peak, 10,000 died daily in Constantinople alone. Bodies overflowed from cemeteries. Justinian ordered the towers of fortress walls hollowed out and filled with corpses stacked like cordwood. Ships were loaded with the dead and set adrift in the sea. The stench became unbearable. Commerce ceased entirely. The city's grain supply, dependent on Egyptian imports, collapsed as plague swept through Alexandria and killed the farmers and sailors. Justinian himself contracted the plague, but survived, one of the fortunate few. His dreams of restoration died with the millions who perished. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 30 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean and Europe, perhaps half the world's population at that time. The Byzantine army, which had been winning, could no longer sustain campaigns. Reconquered territories were lost. The economy never recovered. Cities shrank permanently. Classical learning was abandoned as survival became the only priority. The plague returned in waves for 2 centuries, ensuring that the ancient world could never be rebuilt. What Rome had built over centuries, a microbe destroyed in decades. The Japanese smallpox epidemic. In 735 AD, smallpox arrived in Japan through a simple act of diplomacy. Korean envoys landed on Japanese shores, carrying gifts for the emperor, and among those gifts traveled an invisible killer. Within months, smallpox spread from the imperial court to every corner of the island nation. The Japanese had never encountered this disease. They possessed no immunity, no understanding, no defense. The epidemic that followed would fundamentally reshape Japanese civilization in ways still visible today. The disease manifested with terrifying consistency. High fever struck first, followed by excruciating body aches. Then came the rash, starting in the mouth and spreading across the entire body, transforming into raised pustules that eventually scabbed over. Those who survived bore the scars for life, but survival was rare. The Fujiwara clan, which had dominated Japanese politics for generations, was nearly wiped out. 4 brothers who controlled the government all died within months. The bureaucratic machinery of the state ground to a halt. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers perished in their rice fields. Famine followed plague. Chronicles from the period describe bodies piling up faster than Buddhist monks could perform funeral rites. Mass graves were dug in haste. Entire villages were abandoned. The death toll reached catastrophic proportions, with estimates suggesting 1/3 of Japan's population died. Buddhism, which promised spiritual solace in the face of meaningless death, gained millions of new converts. The imperial government, desperate for divine intervention, commissioned the construction of massive Buddhist temples and statues. The great Buddha of Nara was built directly in response to this epidemic. a monument not to victory but to collective trauma. Japanese society emerged fundamentally changed, more religiously devout, politically restructured, and forever marked by the memory of a disease that arrived without warning and left nothing untouched. The Black Death. In 1346 AD, Mongol forces besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Black Sea employed a weapon that would change human history forever. As plague ravaged their own army, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. Genoese merchants, fleeing by ship, carried the disease to Mediterranean ports. Within 5 years, the Black Death would kill between 75 and 200 million people, erasing perhaps half of Europe's population and fundamentally altering the course of Western civilization. The plague arrived with three distinct forms, each deadly in different ways. Bubonic plague caused the characteristic buboes, swollen lymph nodes that turned black with necrotic tissue. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, spreading through coughing and killing within days. Septicemic plague infected the bloodstream, causing gangrene that turned fingers and toes black before death. No treatment existed. Physicians wearing bird-like masks filled with herbs attempted to ward off miasmic air they believed caused the disease. Their efforts were useless. The rich fled to country estates. The poor died in cramped urban quarters. Neither strategy provided safety. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of apocalyptic horror. In Siena, chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote of burying his 5 children with his own hands. In Florence, Boccaccio observed bodies stacked in mass graves like layers of lasagna. Entire villages were abandoned, left to crumble into ruins. The labor force collapsed, triggering economic upheaval that destroyed the feudal system. Survivors demanded higher wages. Serfs abandoned lords who could no longer enforce their will. The Catholic Church lost credibility as prayers went unanswered, and priests died alongside their flocks. Persecution of Jews intensified as desperate populations sought scapegoats. Art turned macabre, obsessed with death and decay. The Black Death did not just kill people. It killed the medieval worldview, clearing ground for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern age. The Cocoliztli Epidemic. In 1545 AD, just decades after Spanish conquest had already devastated the indigenous peoples of Mexico through smallpox and measles, a new disease emerged that remains one of history's darkest mysteries. The Aztecs called it Cocoliztli, meaning pestilence. It appeared suddenly during a severe drought, spreading through the Valley of Mexico with unprecedented lethality. This was not smallpox or any European disease, the Spanish recognized. Victims suffered from high fever and severe headaches. Blood poured from their eyes, mouths, and noses. Jaundice turned their skin yellow. Death came within 3 to 4 days. Spanish colonial records described the sheer scale of mortality with stunned incomprehension. Entire indigenous communities were wiped out. Bodies decomposed in homes because no one remained alive to bury them. The indigenous population of Mexico, estimated at 20 million before European contact, had already been reduced to 3 million by previous epidemics. The Cocoliztli epidemic killed an additional 15 million people. By 1600, fewer than 1 million indigenous Mexicans remained. This was not gradual decline. This was near extinction. Modern researchers analyzing DNA from victims' teeth have identified Salmonella enterica, a hemorrhagic fever, as the likely culprit. The disease may have been native to the Americas, emerging during drought conditions, or it might have arrived with African slaves. What remains certain is the catastrophic consequence. The Spanish colonial system, dependent on indigenous labor, nearly collapsed. Silver mines shut down. Haciendas were abandoned. The cultural knowledge of Aztec civilization, the agricultural techniques, the astronomical understanding, the medicinal practices, all died with the people who carried them. Within 1 century of European contact, the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas had been reduced to fragments. The Cocoliztli epidemic ensured that Mesoamerican culture could never fully recover, leaving gaps in human knowledge that can never be filled. The Great Plague of London. In 1665 AD, London was Europe's fastest-growing city, packed with 500,000 people living in overcrowded conditions of spectacular filth. When plague-infected fleas arrived that spring, likely aboard Dutch trading ships, the city became a death trap. The Great Plague of London began quietly in the slums of St. Giles, spreading through cramped tenements where multiple families shared single rooms. By summer, the plague was killing thousands every week. The official death toll reached 68,596, but the true number was likely over 100,000, as deaths among the poor often went unrecorded. The wealthy fled immediately, abandoning London to the poor and desperate. King Charles II and his court retreated to Oxford. Merchants closed their businesses and evacuated to country estates. Those left behind faced horror, unlike anything Britain had experienced in living memory. Red crosses were painted on infected houses along with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Families were sealed inside their homes, condemned to die together or survive together. Watchmen stood guard outside to prevent escape. The dead were collected nightly by cart drivers who called, "Bring out your dead," through silent streets. The authorities, desperate to stop the spread, ordered all cats and dogs killed, believing they carried the disease. 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats were slaughtered, eliminating the very predators that controlled the rat population, actually spreading plague through fleas. Mass graves called plague pits were dug throughout the city. Bodies were dumped in by the hundreds, covered with quicklime. The economy collapsed. Trade ceased. The city that had been the commercial heart of an emerging empire stood paralyzed. Then, in September 1666, the Great Fire of London burned through the medieval city center, inadvertently destroying the rat-infested wooden structures where plague thrived. The epidemic ended, but London's population took decades to recover. The Marseille Plague. In 1720 AD, the Age of Enlightenment was transforming Europe. Science was replacing superstition. Medical knowledge was advancing. Plague was considered a relic of the medieval past. Then the merchant ship Grand Saint Antoine arrived in Marseille carrying silk, cotton, and infected fleas from the Levant. Despite showing signs of disease during the voyage, the ship's valuable cargo was too important to quarantine properly. Marseille's merchants pressured authorities to allow unloading. That decision would cost the city half its population. The plague began spreading in late June, concentrated initially around the port. Marseille's health board, recognizing the danger, attempted to implement quarantine measures, but enforcement was inconsistent. The disease spread through the crowded medieval quarters with devastating speed. By August, hundreds were dying daily. The city government erected barriers dividing Marseille into sections, attempting to contain infection. Armed guards shot anyone trying to cross without permission. Bodies piled in the streets because gravediggers could not keep pace. Marseille graves were dug outside the city walls, filled continuously as the death toll mounted toward 50,000 within the city, and another 50,000 in surrounding Provence. The economic consequences radiated throughout Europe. Marseille was France's most important Mediterranean port, central to trade networks stretching to the Middle East and Asia. Other nations imposed strict quarantines on French ships and goods. Trade collapsed. The French economy contracted sharply. King Louis XV dispatched military forces to enforce a cordon around Provence, preventing anyone from leaving under penalty of death. The Mur de la Peste, a plague wall, was constructed to seal off infected regions. The epidemic finally burned out in 1722, after killing 100,000 people. This outbreak, arriving in the Age of Reason, shattered Enlightenment confidence that humanity had conquered nature. It proved that progress was fragile, and that ancient threats could return at any moment to humble human ambition. The Third Plague Pandemic. In 1894 AD, as European empires controlled most of the world and medical science seemed poised to conquer disease, plague returned with global reach. The Third Plague Pandemic began in China's Yunnan province, spreading along trade routes newly accelerated by steamships and railways. Within a decade, plague had reached every inhabited continent. Unlike previous outbreaks confined to specific regions, this pandemic demonstrated that the modern connected world could spread disease faster and farther than ever before. Over the next 6 decades, 12 million people would die. Hong Kong became the epidemic's focal point. When plague arrived in 1894, the city's cramped tenements and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for rat-borne transmission. Researchers from around the world descended on Hong Kong, competing to identify the causative organism. Alexandre Yersin, a French bacteriologist, successfully isolated Yersinia pestis, proving that plague was bacterial, not miasmic air. His discovery enabled the development of treatments and prevention strategies, yet the pandemic continued spreading. India was devastated. losing over 10 million people. Bombay and Calcutta saw massive die-offs. San Francisco experienced outbreaks that authorities initially denied to protect business interests, allowing the disease to become endemic in local rodent populations. The pandemic revealed uncomfortable truths about colonialism and public health. British authorities in India demolished entire neighborhoods inhabited by the poor, claiming sanitary necessity while leaving European quarters untouched. Forced inspections and segregations were imposed primarily on native populations. Resistance to these measures sometimes turned violent. The plague also exposed the limitations of modern medicine. Despite understanding the bacterial cause, effective treatment remained unavailable until antibiotics were developed in the 1940s. The third plague pandemic officially lasted until 1960, making it the longest pandemic in recorded history. It never truly ended, but rather faded into background endemic disease. Today, plague still exists in wild rodent populations worldwide, a permanent reminder that humanity's ancient enemies are never fully defeated, merely waiting.